Human rights activist and Kurdish rights campaigner from Strasburg, Sarah Glynn, and UNISON member of National Executive, um, Stephen Smellie. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. So, dear Sarah, let's start with you first. You have signed the coalition as a member of a delegation in UK against chemical weapons. So, very short, very briefly, can you give us a little bit more details about that coalition that came together in UK?
Well, it's a reaction to the failure of international organizations to properly investigate all the very many reports of chemical weapons attacks against the Kurds by Turkey in northern Iraq. And there's been endless requests to the authorities that are supposed to investigate, and nothing's happened. The reports are really worrying, and it's a very difficult thing because if you're in the middle of a war zone and if you don't have the facilities, how do you actually prove what's happening? And international organizations and other countries can just say, oh, there isn't sufficient proof, but it's for them to actually instigate and make sure that an investigation and make sure that there is proof. And actually, you know, there's been really horrific descriptions from people who've survived it, and their descriptions both of what happened to people who died and what happened to themselves and the long-term effects of the chemicals that they've experienced on them is appalling.
Just before I go to the Stephen, I would like to ask you that as well. One of the members of NATO is Turkey, which in recent years has been found to have supported ISIS gangs, invaded the Kurdish region of Syria, and recently there have been even have been reports of Turkey using chemical weapons against Kurdish forces and civilians. What is your view of these actions? How would you evaluate that very briefly?
I suppose appalled but not surprised. I mean, it is actually one of many human rights abuses that Turkey has been perpetrating against the Kurds. There's actually been a history of accusations of Turkey using chemical weapons against the Kurds, going right back to the 1980s, and none of them have been properly investigated. And Turkey's made it very, very difficult for people to investigate. But the chemical weapons attacks that they've been accused of now, I mean, that's just one of the things that they're doing at the moment. So at the same time, they're stopping water from getting to Syria. They're doing targeted assassinations of people in Sinjar and the Mahmoud refugee camp. It's endless what's going on, and of course, all the things that's happening in the occupied areas with the mercenaries that Turkey has brought there and ethnic cleansing. So yes, it's one of many crimes against humanity.
Thank you, dear Stephen. So, just to underline it, why does the United Nations and EU remain silent about the chemical weapons used against the Kurds, despite the claims and evidences on this issue?
I think these organisations, the United Nations and Europe, are made up of states who have their own interests, and the interests of the Kurds, or the interests of truth in terms of what's happening, don't always coincide with the interests of the states, of the powerful states, the United Nations, or United States, Britain, Germany, and other states like that, have other priorities. And I think you can see that from the actions they do take in relation to some states, Syria, for example. They investigate allegations of chemical weapons in Syria, but they don't investigate chemical weapons allegations against the likes of Turkey and other situations. So only they act when it suits them. They have their own interests, and they don't, unfortunately, coincide with the interests of ordinary people on the ground, including Kurdish people in this case.
On our earlier interview with you 2 weeks ago, we have mentioned the OPCW and IFPNW as well, and as a result, you have underlined that these both institutions are politically turning blind eye on Turkey's war crimes. Would you like to comment on that little bit more, just to underline it, why they don't take action against Turkey's war crimes and start make investigations of chemical weapons allegations? Very short, very briefly.
Well, it's appalling that they don't. The purpose of those organisations existing is to investigate these circumstances. Now, as Sarah was saying earlier on, it's their duty to investigate the evidence. Allegations have been made, they need to be investigated, and the fact that they have failed to even engage in a discussion about that is an indictment on their other priorities, which are not their interests of people on the ground suffering from alleged chemical weapons attacks. So it's appalling, and that's why the pressure needs to be applied on them to take action.
Thank you. So, dear Sarah, another significant issue is about Kurdish leader Mr. Abdullah Öcalan's isolation. What is Turkey trying to achieve? And do you think by isolating Mr. Öcalan, Turkish regime is also aiming to isolate Kurdish people too? Very shortly.
I think they do everything in their power to crush any sign of Kurdish resistance, and Turkey is always, it's in the constitution of the Turkish Republic, the one nation, the one language, the one culture thing, but so there's always been a presumption against Kurdishness, but also the Kurds have been the most successful form of resistance to the Turkish state, both within Turkey and out with Turkey. So there's that added pressure on them, and they have gone, they only see one way of reacting to this. I mean, once they turned away from any idea of the peace process, all they do is crush more and crush more. And they've sort of gone down a rabbit hole of more and more military response, really, to any resistance.
Dear Stephen, I would like to also remind to our audience that the isolation of the Kurdish leader Öcalan and the relation of the keeping the PKK in the terrorist organization list. So, if you can answer very short, very briefly, how important is the freedom for Öcalan, and would you comment? How would you comment on to the relation between keeping PKK on terrorist organizations list and isolation of the Kurdish leader Öcalan?
The freedom for Abdullah Öcalan is fundamental to the prospects for peace and democracy, not just within Turkey, but within the region. He is the identified and agreed leader of the Kurdish freedom movement, and he should be freed. So also central to that is the delisting of the PKK, because if you're interested in peace and democracy, then you want the people who are party can lead you to that round, sitting at a table discussing with you, not locked away or hiding in mountains or wherever else you wish to chase them to. They need to be sitting there. So these two issues are linked. They're fundamental to the struggle for peace and democracy. And anyone who's interested in peace and democracy in the region should be on the side of bringing Abdullah Öcalan back to the negotiating table and the PKK back to the negotiating table, discussing how we can bring about peace.
Dear Sarah, dear Stephen has already mentioned about the peace and democracy. process in the region. And so why should the PKK be delisted now, and what can be done to delist the PKK? Just to underline that the PKK is one of the key roles to bring peace and democracy actually to the region. How would you going to comment on that very shortly?
I guess there's two approaches and they interact. So clearly there's the legal arguments, and those are important. And the fairly recent Belgian court case arguing that the PKK should not be considered as a terrorist organization because it's a party in a non-state conflict is really important. But that also needs to be backed by a political movement, and the politicians in power will only respond if there's movement from below and pressure from below. So really it's the case of bringing those things together, the legal arguments, the political arguments, but the political arguments that are responding to a mass movement. And we do need that mass movement from below in the same way as we saw against apartheid in South Africa.
Thank you. Dear Stephen, lastly, do you think the Brussels High Court decision about the PKK can affect the delisting of the PKK process in the UK?
Well, it should do. It sets a precedent, and Sarah's referred to that angle. So it sets a precedent that the British courts have to take on board when the evidence that was discussed in Brussels is then presented in a British court. I would hope that the British court would take that, give that credence, and look at that properly. So yes, it should have an impact on the position in the UK.
Thank you. And lastly, with your last words, what is your call to the international institutions to investigate the chemical weapon allegations in the region, as well as also in UK, there will be a movement about delisting the PKK. So what is your message? What is your call to the international institutions about these two very important issues?
I think there's a need for leadership here. There's a need for those people who are interested in peace and democracy to actually step up to the plate and demonstrate leadership. So leaders of political parties, leaders of civil movements, leaders of trade unions and others should be speaking up to say that if there are chemical weapons being used anywhere, that needs to be investigated, and if it turns out to be true, action needs to be taken against the perpetrators of that. That's the first thing. Everybody who stands for peace and democracy and humanity should take that stand. When it comes to the question of delisting the PKK, there is an injustice which has been instigated here for many years at the behest of the Turkish state, and other states have supported that. And the consequences of that have been 30 years of war, a negation of democracy, and a failure to achieve peace in the situation. We need people sitting at the negotiating table talking about peace, not fighting, not trying to figure out how we can continue a conflict of war. So the delisting of the PKK is about peace, and those people need to step up to the plate, demanding peace.
Thank you. Dear Sarah, we will end up our program with you. So what is your last call to the international institutions to investigate chemical weapons allocations, as well as you know, the delisting the PKK is another significant issue. So what is your message to the international institutions in that very important two issues?
I think I would ask them to actually look at the bigger picture, and this is in the interests of peace for everyone. It's in the interests of, if they're international organizations that have any credibility at all, then they have to investigate all accusations, not just the ones that suit them. They have to look at the inconvenient truths too. But actually, the way that they're going at the moment is creating such instability in that part of the world. and creating the conditions for more ISIS-type organizations, for all the things that they say that they're against. So I would ask them to look at the bigger picture. If they're only interested in their own self-interest, actually, this is in their own self-interest. It's in all of our interests.
Dear Sarah Glynn, human rights activist and Kurdish rights campaigner and UNISON member of the National Executive, Stephen Smellie, thanks for joining us. Thank you to both of you for your valuable comments today.
Thank you.
Thank you.